Welcome, everybody. It's a great pleasure to welcome all of you to this literary panel, Crossing Waters, Blixen Crossing Borders, which is taking place across 2 continents, in 2 world capitals, Paris and New York. That's very much in the spirit of the life and work of our subject today, Karen Blixen. My name is Catherine Lefebvre, and I'm the cultural attaché as well as director of La Fondation Danoise. Here we are gathered in Paris in an exhibition by Jeannette Ehlers in the space Le Bicolore with the title Crossing Waters, Ripples of Tomorrow. The topics that Jeannette Ehlers is underlining in her work are part of what we will be exchanging about tonight. Blixen truly crossed borders in her life, and as we read her, the borders seem to represent even more the lines we cross when we try to understand her work as well as her time. When I started out this job with the Danish Embassy in Paris and the Fondation Danoise, I promised His Excellency Denmark's ambassador to France, Michael Starbæk Christensen, to do a talk about Blixen. Together with the excellent team of Le Bicolore, we found the perfect match. Let's do it in this exhibition. It is a pleasure to say a very special welcome to Michael tonight, who honors us with his presence here. Thank you so much for being here. I would also like to introduce the 3 participants on tonight's panel. So please join me in welcoming Njoki Ng'ang'a of Columbia University in New York, Judith Thurman, Blixen's esteemed biographer, who are joining us virtually on screen from New York, and Thomas Wisniewski, a lecturer of comparative literature at Harvard University, who is here with us tonight. Thank you for being here, all of you. All 3 panelists are implicated in Blixen's work and art. All 3 have been researching and writing about Blixen for many years. Of course, Judith Thurman, as you all know, wrote the renowned biography Isak Dinesen, The Life of a Storyteller, that came out in 1982, for which she recently wrote a preface for the new edition. I think it will be very interesting to hear your considerations about this new preface for the new American edition of this wonderful book. Judith Thurman wrote the much acclaimed Colette biography as well, and writes for The New Yorker on a regular basis. Njoki Ng'ang'a of Columbia University in New York is a Kenyan scholar and researcher, in particular in African women's health, and has, and I just turned the page, and has been researching Blixen and public health, and has made very interesting considerations with her contemporary lecture of Blixen's work and historical period. Is this working, Nato? Okay. Thomas Wisniewski, a lecturer of comparative literature at Harvard, where he's leading a research team conducting archival work for a documentary film that we actually work on together, which is in development. It's entitled A Winter's Tale, Karen Blixen in America, a new thing which is coming up. It's a transatlantic Danish-American collaboration, and previously you collaborated with the Karen Blixen Museum with a lecture and essay entitled Blixen's Hugo, commissioned for the, I think you can... On essaie encore. Moi, là, ça va. Merci. So you did a very nice article on Blixen's Hugo, and we collaborated together. And it was commissioned for the inauguration of the 2018 exhibition, Babette, the Paris Commune, and Life in Exile. It was also a collaboration with the Maison de Victor Hugo here in Paris, which was great. Currently, you are revising a book for publication entitled Self-Translation and The Sound of Prose, Blixen, Borges, and Wilde. Very interesting. I myself worked as the director of the Karen Blixen Museum for 10 years, from 2009 to 2019, as well as literary executor of the Blixen estate. During my years as director, I was very involved in communicating a post-colonial and international reading of Blixen's work and life, and had the immense pleasure of collaborating with great artists. Our point of departure this evening will be as different as we all are. But we have all the passion together for understanding and reading, and this will be the narrative thread tonight. Thank you to all great involved colleagues at Le Bicolore and La Maison du Danemark. It is a great pleasure to have you all as our audience tonight. And after the presentations, we will open the discussion for a Q&A, and for those of you in the room, we will serve a verre de l'amitié and continue informal discussions about tonight's topic. Thank you so much for coming and welcome, and I think that I will pass on the word immediately to Judith Thurman, who is with us tonight from New York. You can see Judith and Njoki on the screen. And Judith, I pass the word to you first, then your colleague in New York, and then Thomas, and then myself. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Catherine. Grand merci à tout le monde là-bas à Paris. I'm very sad, I'm sure Njoki is too, that we can't join you for the verre after this discussion. It's only 1 o'clock in the afternoon here, it would be a bit early. First, I'd like to say that this is a sort of cross-continental discussion, but it's not just Europe and America. It's Europe, America, and Africa. And Njoki and I want to concentrate, which is also it's an explanation of how we met, on the question of how to read out of Africa in 2024, 50 years after I started work on my biography of Tennyson. And Njoki wrote to me several weeks ago. We hadn't met, we didn't know each other. The most beautiful letter saying that she's from Kenya. She's from the Kikuyu group. She grew up there. She's lived in America for quite a while as well. She is very, very involved with Africa, with women's health in Africa, and with African literature as well as with world literature. So she wrote to me saying that she had been to visit the grave of Dennis Finch Hatton outside of Nairobi and looked at the view and was contemplating the experience, which is the great love song of Out of Africa, the loss of the thing that you most love, and how you integrate that experience into your life. And then she asked me, which is a question I have considered, but did not consider so much at the time I was writing the book, how we should think about Karen Blixen's depiction of Africa as a white colonial settler. So we are going to be talking about that. And first I would like to say here, this is a kind of very belated mea culpa, and I say a little bit about this in the new introduction to the book. 50 years ago, I did not pay at all as much attention to the issue of colonialism and settler colonialism, let's call it what it was, that I should have, and that the issue certainly deserved. It's a dimension that's missing from the book. If I could do it over, I would add a long chapter on the history of Kenya, not just the history of Kenya as seen through the lens of Karen Blixen and the other British settlers who bought land from the British government that had belonged and had been confiscated from the people who Njoki is descended from. And it was a feudal world. They lived in a kind of serfdom. And Blixen calls them squatters, she calls them the natives, but they were enserfed. They were dispossessed and enserfed Africans living on land that had been theirs. So I would like Njoki to speak a bit about her experience thinking about and reading Blixen in Africa and in relation to the Kenyan literature that she also admires so much. No sound. No sound. No sound still.
I am so sorry. Let me see if I can try and troubleshoot
That's
what the
good.
problem is.
We have you. We have you.
Oh, now you can hear me? Okay, great.
Yes.
So thank you so much, Catherine and Judith, for inviting me to this talk. As Judith mentioned, my background is actually not in literature. Judith said it's not my beat. However, it's not mine. But it is true. My work has mostly been in women's health. And, you know, I've been well acquainted with Blixen since my childhood, but had not really considered her until recently when I was writing an article about the experience of women who were pregnant and came near death during the COVID-19 pandemic. The genre of this work is called narrative medicine, which is where we take complex medical problems and present them to a lay audience using a literary, more easier to understand style. And when I was looking for a way to describe or to capture how my patients had told me about how they were feeling when they were gravely ill, I remembered the words of Blixen. Blixen was known to have suffered from syphilis, an infectious disease for which there was no treatment at that time. As far as I know, and I think as far as we know, she suffered from 2 pregnancy losses. And she's written about it in a very eloquent way, as only she can. Now, this struck me as a bit problematic because I'm an African woman. I'm of Kenyan descent. For a time, around the time that Blixen was living in Kenya, my grandmother, my paternal grandmother, was actually living in Masailand. So there are many times reading Out of Africa, I wondered if they had crossed paths even. Now, taking that into consideration, I also knew that Blixen had come across, she had been criticized heavily, most famously by the Kenyan author Ngugi wa Thiong'o, who's been nominated for the Nobel Prize several times. He has been very vehement in his criticism, not only of her portrayal of one particular case. I don't know if we wanted to go into the details of that case now, but essentially, he is criticizing the colonial mindset that did not criticize the miscarriage of justice that colonialism was, if we can be honest about that fact. So taking all of these things into consideration, I thought, so how can I, as a Kenyan woman, then have such an affinity for, you know, this lyrical writing that is capturing exactly what I want to say about what my patients were telling me? How, if I'm criticized for that, how then do I defend myself? And I wanted to have a very well thought out argument for why I had chosen to cite Blixen in this particular essay. And I thought that I might actually go on a trip to Denmark to see what people thought there of her. And I reached out to Judith. And Judith was about to go on vacation, but she drafted, just as only she can, this very eloquent response to me and said, "This is very suing." And so it seems to me very serendipitous that this exhibition is happening at this very time that Judith and I have been having this conversation. And that, in a nutshell, is how I came to be involved with Blixen.
The screen is frozen. I don't know if, there, that's better.
There you are.
Let's talk between us and with the audience about the issue of the criticisms, of Yongo's criticisms of her. Of course, she belonged to the colonial class. Her family, her rich Danish family, financed a coffee farm at a time when the Kenyans had no vote in their own affairs. It was managed by the British government and by the colonial office. They were disenfranchised. Only whites could vote. Karen Blixen, I have to say, argued very passionately for the enfranchisement of both Africans and Indians who were also not allowed to vote in anything. They weren't allowed to plant coffee because it was Kenyans were not allowed to plant coffee as it was potentially a rivalry for the British plantations. But how do you answer the criticisms? She did not look upon the Africans the way most of the British colonists did, as inferior, as primitive, as savages, as all of the cliches, all of the horrible racist cliches of colonialism. She had a romantic view. She had an idealizing and also condescending and, in a way, feudal view. One can't deny that either. And her fantasy, her illusion, in a way, of this special mystical bond with them. She didn't ask them if they felt that they had that mystical bond with her. So this was kind of one-sided love affair in some ways. Although many of the people who worked on the farm were deeply grateful to her, she educated the children of some of the people who worked for her. One of whom went on to become a judge in Somalia, and others to be able to satisfy their avid curiosity for learning. She wanted to open a children's hospital in Masailand. So she wasn't the average racist colonist, and yet she was a member of that world. Out of Africa, I wanted to talk to you about, in a personal way, about this sense of the way that she deals with loss, because it's one of the things that I think moves me most about her work. She suffered physically terribly. She suffered the loss of the farm. She suffered the loss of her father, who killed himself when she was 10. She suffered terrible body blows, heart blows, soul blows all her life. And storytelling was the way that she made sense of them. And Out of Africa is, in a way, the way she makes sense out of this unbearable loss, which was not only of the land and a connection to the people and a connection to a world that was so different from the one that she came from, but also the other losses in her life. So, and it gives you heart. Dinnison's work has always, in a sense, given me heart in my own moments of depression. She suffered terribly from depression. So I felt a great affinity with you in that conundrum, because I'm critical of her too.
Yeah, so I think that's a paradox about Blixen, isn't it? I mean, if I don't know that it's possible to consider whether one is if there's a spectrum of racism. Do you know what I'm saying? Because I get your point that if you put up Blixen right next to any average British colonialist, she would have been more on the milder end of that spectrum. So you can call it colonialism light, if you will.
Yeah.
Right? But on the other hand, there were things that she said in Out of Africa that were quite cringe to me. And you and I have spoken about this. There's one, she on many occasions referred or compared Africans to animals.
Yeah.
There's one particular incident where her cook, Commander, prepared a delicious, in his eyes, delicious dish for her. It was a piece of roasted sweet potato and some meat. Now, if you're from Kenya, you've been to Kenya, we have something called nyama choma, which is, everyone loves it, including myself. And it's, if you can think about it, it's the perfectly marbled meat with the perfect amount of salt just charred on the grill. And this is what Commander brought to her. But Blixen was a connoisseur of French dining, French fine dining. So to her, this did not represent any sort of labor or thought in the way that she understood. And she said, even a domesticated dog would not present a meal such as this. And, to me, reading it as a Kenyan, I said, first of all, every home I've been to, I've been served nyama choma. This is something we all eat. But to compare this cook as a dog, to me, I was blown away. But on the other hand, she also talks about his gift in the kitchen, how he was a genius in the kitchen, So how do we then reconcile the same Blixen who's talking about Commander as a gifted cook with Commander, the domesticated dog? This is the paradox of Blixen, right?
It is.
And another incident that I thought about in Out of Africa that really relates to my work is in the section titled An Immigrant's Notebook. And in that section, she talks about one of her houseboys, the wife of one of her houseboys was having a really difficult labor. And Blixen was known to sort of be the doctor in residence at her farm. And so the houseboy sent for her to be called to see if she could help. And of course, she couldn't. So she then sent a message to a neighbor who was a newly immigrated doctor from England. And he came, and it was raining, and she said it was storming. The car could not be pulled out to drive this poor woman to a hospital, either at the Scottish Mission or to Nairobi. But this doctor came, and he helped, and she successfully delivered the baby. But then he sent her a note later, and he said, because of you, I came just this once. But just so you know, this can never happen again. I can never be called to take care of another native again. And he says, in my practice, I've been known to take care of the elite of Bournemouth. So here again is another paradox, right? So this Englishman was not willing to ever be called again to take care of another native woman. But I think if Blixen had been called again, she would have gone, regardless of what it would have taken for her to go and help a native. So these are the paradoxes that we encounter in her writing that I think in our Kenyan criticism of her have not sufficiently addressed. So when Gauguin was critical of the Kitosh saga, which is she recounted the documentary in a documentary way, the story of this boy that had been killed by a white settler. He was beaten to death, we should say. But as he was coming to death, he uttered the words in Swahili, "Nataka kufa,"
The screen is frozen.
which translated literally means I want to die. But when you put in the cultural context, it could mean dying or I am about to die. Now, when Blixen retold the story in Out of Africa, she sort of very poetically said that the words of this boy had exonerated this settler, sentenced to 2 years in prison. And this is a criticism that she has faced, particularly from Goge Wathiongo, who has said that how could she not decry this miscarriage. But we now know in her other writing, in a letter to her mother, for example, she had said this, she thought that this man had gotten away with murder. So when I think of how to answer the question that Judith and I have been speaking about, I think that when we criticize her, we should take into account all of the sources, all of her sources, all of the sources that she's left us, her letters, and taken together with her writing, we can come up with a more well-rounded
Judgment.
I guess, position or judgment, yeah.
We're going to go on because we're very interested, of course, in hearing what Catherine and Tom have to say. I just want to say here that she was criticized in Denmark for her writing about Denmark as well, in not exactly the same, but in similar terms. During the Depression, her nostalgia for the old feudal way of life, the old aristocratic way of life on the great Herregård, the estates of seemed completely irrelevant and fantastical to many Danes who wanted realistic representations of Danish life and not nostalgic ones of a lost world. And of course, for Dinesen, Africa was a lost Eden. And it was hardly that for the Africans who were not only dispossessed from their own land, but had all kinds of violence and violence with the colonial powers. But finally, we don't judge great literature by anybody. It has to be set in the period in which it was written. It has to be read with some kind of historical context. And there's a danger in applying standards of correctness from one era of importing them back to another, although there are certain basic human notions of justice which are not negotiable. And the shared humanity of everybody seems to be one of them. So I hope that you'll come back to us later with questions. And I now turn the floor back over to Catherine. Thank you so much, Njoki.
Thank you so much to our New York panel. It's a great pleasure to see you here. And I feel very grateful that even though there was a few cracks on the line, it was really, really easy to understand what you were saying. So thank you so much. So now I have the pleasure of passing on the word to you, Thomas, in this room with a PowerPoint and a manuscript I can see. And I think it's going to be about letters, maybe.
Thank you very much, Catherine, and thanks everyone for joining us this evening, and to my fellow panelists. I look forward to the Q&A to follow. My contribution is going to be some remarks I've prepared in connection with the themes of this exhibition by the artist Jeannette Ehlers, and also in connection with the ongoing project that I have with Catherine, which she mentioned in the introduction earlier this evening. And that's a documentary film in progress, which we're calling A Winter's Tale, Karen Blixen in America. I wonder, Catherine, if you could ask Nathan if he can fix the remote control. While they're doing that, I'll keep to the allotted time so that we do have time for questions and conversations to follow. The time frame that I've chosen to focus on in this short talk is 1958 to 1962. 4 years, and to give you just a glimpse into those years, which are the last 4 years of the life of Karen Blixen, I've structured my remarks with a selection of excerpts from 4 letters. 4 letters that, thank you, Nathan. 4 letters that frame the time. I think everyone can see the slide now. The time just before and just after her American tour in the winter of 1959, which is the focus of our documentary research and the climax of the film that falls so near the end of her life. The first letter I've chosen was written 4 years before Karen Blixen's death in 1962. In it, she meditates on her failing health and her mortality, in contrast to what seems to be her own mythical immortality as a storyteller. She writes to her old Swedish friend in Kenya, Ingrid Lindström, and the letter is dated June 18th, 1958. Judith Thurman, in her masterful biography, which if you haven't read, it's out in a new paperback edition, citing the personal archives of Mrs. Lindström. I'm not going to quote it in full from this letter. I'm going to quote an excerpt from this letter, but the others I will quote in full. So I'll paraphrase and then quote a bit from the letter. Blixen writes to Lindström, then still living in the Highlands, now a grandmother and a widow after the death of her husband. She's writing a letter of farewell not only to her old friend, but to her past life in the Highlands. She sends her condolences, and towards the end of the letter she writes, and here I quote in Blixen's words, I myself hear from and about some of my old people, Kamante, Tumbo, Abdullahi. I have also sometimes thought of visiting Kenya, but it has certainly changed too much for me, and I would come to feel like a ghost there. She continues, unfortunately, I have for the last 4 years been laid up in a hospital bed or in bed at home, and I don't think that I shall improve very much. I cannot get my weight over 35 kilos, and I have a kind of paralysis of the legs so that I can't really stand up or walk. However, it has been a great happiness that through a superhuman work of slavery, which would have been criminal if one had imposed it on another, I published a book last year and am having a book published next autumn. Lindström Judith Thurman reminds us was not flattered and in fact was hurt by Blixen's earlier portrait of her in Out of Africa. And so I think it's striking here to note the elegiac tone with which Blixen writes to her old friend. It's the same tone of loss that cuts through the last book that she'll publish in her lifetime, Shadows in the Grass. When she signs this letter, it is with gratitude and with a final goodbye. She writes, thank you for all the good in life. God bless you. Here I'd like to emphasize the superhuman power that Blixen claims she has summoned to finish not one but 2 books, not named in the letter, but which are Last Tales, 1957, and Antidotes of Destiny, 1958. In the letter, she seems astonished at her ability to write at all, while still so ill, at times feeling as though she's on the precipice of death, and yet summons the psychic strength of the master storyteller, Isak Dinesen, the one who forestalls death through writing. Blixen's disabled body, after an operation in 1955, she depended almost entirely on Clara Svensson to dictate her tales and complete the Danish translations, is described in this letter, but without self-pity. The body is paralyzed, the mind is not. The act of storytelling is for Blixen a means of staving off death, just as it was for Scheherazade, after whom Isak Dinesen styles herself when she compares her own figure in the early work to that of the cross-legged Scheherazade sitting in front of the fire, telling stories to Dennis Finch Hatton in Out of Africa. And again in the late work, Last Tales, when she envisions echoes of the 1001 Nights as she begins to embark on a project impossible to finish so late in life. The Abondakani, an unfinished series of tales featured in her penultimate collection of fiction, Last Tales, published 5 years before her death. Her desire there was to write a collection of hundreds of tales, or even, as an homage to the Arabian Nights, 1001. So Blixen, who suffered most of her adult life, as we've heard from our fellow panelists, from syphilis, arsenic poisoning, anorexia, and other ailments, could hardly eat in the years and in the last years and would die of emaciation. She considered her chronic illness a necessity for the mastery of her art. Here we might recall that Faustian bargain she supposed she made long ago when she once told a friend, and I quote, I promised the devil my soul, and in return he promised me that everything I was going to experience hereafter would be turned into tales, end quote. One of her great American admirers, Ernest Hemingway, who famously said the Nobel Prize should have gone to her when he got it, had another way of putting it. He says, all stories have continued far enough, end in death, and he is no true storyteller who would keep that from you. So if staving off death is what storytellers do to generate their art, it's what Scheherazade does to save her life and spare her sister's life, then it's also what Karen Blixen does in her life in her writing and towards the end of her life in traveling. This brings me back to the American tour and to the documentary film that Catherine and I are researching. Blixen's letter to Lindström, which I quoted, is dated June 18th, 1958. Just a half year later, on January 2nd, 1959, Blixen will summon this superhuman strength when once again staving off death, like Tennyson's Ulysses. She will set off on one last great voyage before it's too late for her to cross the Atlantic for the first and last time, where she'll meet her American readers in New York and Boston, subsisting on an aristocratic diet born as much of luxury as of necessity: white grapes, oysters, and champagne. The beginning of that story, culminating in this dramatic climax, that is the curtain call of her literary life, is first the story of an unknown Danish author rising to fame in the United States, which is to say that the American reception of her work, which begins with the publication of 7 Gothic Tales in 1934, culminates with the American tour in 1959, and ends not with her death in 1962, but lives on with her legacy in American and world literature, and in Danish literature, and in cinema to this day. I'm emphasizing the American tour because it's the focus of my current research on Blixen, and the team I'm supervising is uncovering neglected or forgotten primary sources that are kept in Harvard's archives. This is because Blixen visited Harvard and Radcliffe in February of 1959. There are letters, photographs, recordings, news clippings that will feature in the film, a few of which I'll share with you shortly in my slides today, but also because one of the 3 tales that Blixen chooses to tell from memory in New York and in Boston in the winter of that year, 1959, is The King's Letter, which is the title of my talk. And it is that tale, told by a Dane near death about her past in colonial Kenya to American audiences, whose themes intersect strikingly with some of the questions that we're raising on today's panel: racial and social inequality, European aristocratic privilege, and British colonialism. So, The King's Letter. Why then does Blixen choose to retell The King's Letter to the United States, in the winter of 1959, when she meets her American readers for the first time in the flesh? She had written this piece, Barua Soldani, which she titles in Swahili, first for the Danish radio in 1950. Yet it was still unpublished in 1959 and only appeared after the American tour in Esquire magazine on December 1st, 1960. Here I've taken just a screenshot from Esquire magazine's website so you can see where it first appeared in the United States. The piece would then become the second chapter and the last book published during her lifetime. And there's another image of the Esquire magazine publication, Shadows on the Grass, which I like to think of as her swan song. It is the slender, poetic, elegiac, and long-awaited sequel to Out of Africa, published right at the end of her life, 1960 in England and Denmark, and 1961 in the United States. She learned her lesson after publishing 7 Gothic Tales, that she should not first publish in the US and second in Denmark, but vice versa, or simultaneously. So it's from that book that I've chosen my central example today, not The King's Letter itself, which Catherine very recently told me is not blood-stained at all as Blixen describes it in the tale, but rather is kept as a clean copy in the Royal Library in Copenhagen, hoping I'll go there and see it one day, but a recollection on the effect of that letter, which gives rise to what Karen Blixen calls, in opposition to her fiction, one of her true tales, The King's Letter. The plot of this piece, though quickly summarized, doesn't do justice to the lyricism of her writing. Nevertheless, to refresh your memories, I'll paraphrase. The story begins with Blixen's direct address to her readers of Out of Africa, from a vantage point decades later, as she recalls for them shooting a lion with Dennis Fitch-Hatton early one morning on New Year's Day many years ago. She has the lion skinned in London and sends the hide as a gift to the King of Denmark, Christian X, who reigned from 1912 to 1947. Sometime after her return to her farm in Kenya, she receives a royal letter of thanks from Copenhagen, and one afternoon, with that very letter from Christian X tucked into her pocket, she comes upon a terrible accident on the road. The leg of a Kikuyu boy has been crushed beneath a felled tree. Wanting to alleviate the boy's pain, but having no morphine and little more than a bit of sugar, which soon runs out, she improvises. She tells him that the letter of a king will do away with the pain. And magically it does as she places it on his chest, while Farah drives them to the hospital in Nairobi, where the boy's leg is set and eventually heals. So what seems to be a minor miracle, the boy is saved, thanks to what is now believed on the farm to be a kind of talisman. And so the king's letter continues to circulate for years as a kind of pain reliever, used by the Kikuyu to alleviate the suffering of people in distress. I'll have more to say about this story, and I think our fellow panelists I'm interested in hearing their critical interpretation of this colonialist parable, if we think of it that way. But what I'd like to do first is actually to hear a bit of Blixen's performing this tale in February of 1959. So one of the recordings we have in the archives is an archival recording of her performance on February 19th, 1959, when she would perform from memory. She wasn't even reading. She was reciting almost verbatim again and again a set of 3 tales, including the King's Letter, during that American tour. So I'll play for you 3 audio clips. I've abridged them for you, so they're quite short. And we tested them earlier today, so you hear Karen Blixen's voice echoing through this exhibition space, which I think is just perfect. I want you to listen to how she first introduces herself to her American audience, expressing her gratitude for her readers welcoming her during the publication of 7 Gothic Tales in a way that she felt she was at first ignored in Denmark, and then how she frames the King's Letter. Then when I play the end of the recording, you'll hear the last paragraph of the piece as she had written it for Danish radio and then revised it for the American tour, which is not how it appears in print in 1960 in Shadows on the Grass. So I'll compare it to the final publication, since it raises questions of colonialism, which is one of the themes of today's panel. So here are the 3 short clips which I've abridged of Isak Dinesen performing on February 20th, 1959 at the Graduate Center of Radcliffe College. And I have just a few archival images so you can see what that looked like. Here she is at Radcliffe in February 1959. Here's the Radcliffe Free News clipping from the newspaper, reporting on her visit to campus, surrounded by what seems to be adoring female graduate students, and an image of the room in which she performed that evening. So that's the room that you can envision as you hear her voice. So first, the introduction and her thanks to her audience. Second, the introduction of the King's Letter. And third, the ending of that true tale. So if Nathan, if you could play the first clip, thank you very much.
I am very happy to be here in Cambridge to speak to you. And I want to thank my American readers for welcoming me as they've done. The first time, 25 years ago, when I came across the ocean in the shape of a book called 7 Gothic Tales, which at home in Denmark they wouldn't publish.
And now we have the introduction of the King's Letter.
The story I'm going to tell you here, which has not been printed before, is called in the Swahili, the language of the natives, Barua Asultani, and in English, The King's Letter.
If we had time, we would listen to the entire recording, but we'll go to the end and hear the last paragraph of the King's Letter.
Will feel, each of us, as I do, the wish that something we have written, that I have written, Mokono Yango, with by my own hand, may at some time, in some place, to people in need, be Barua Asultani.
Now I'd like to compare that reading or that performance to the published last paragraph of the King's Letter, or Barua Soldani, which is the second chapter of Shadows on the Grass, published a year later. And I'll read the passage for you, which I'm projecting on the screen. She writes, "The blood on my sheet of paper is not proud or edifying. It is the blood of a dumb nation. But then the handwriting on it is that of a king, Mokoni Yake. No ode will be written about my letter. Still today it is, I believe, history as much as the relic of Rosenberg. Within it, in paper and blood, a covenant has been signed between the Europeans and the Africans. No similar document of the same relationship is likely to be drawn up again." That's the last paragraph, which emphasizes a poetic, antiquated, and indeed biblical word to describe what Blixen mythologizes as a sacred relationship that she brokers with the placebo healing powers of a royal letter between Europeans and Africans, which she calls a covenant. Covenant is a word I'll return to since it raises the question of British colonialism in Kenya and romanticizes it. And I think Judith Thurman, in her new foreword to the biography, is rightfully critical of that word. So I'll return to it shortly. But I also want to reflect as to why Blixen might have chosen to tell this tale in the United States in 1959, revisiting what seems to be on the surface a parable or even a celebration of colonialism. In that reading, here is a less charitable summary of the story to revise the earlier summary I gave you. You kill a wild African animal native to Kenya, the lion. You send his skin first to London, then to Copenhagen as a gift to the king. And in return, you are given a letter of thanks, which you then use to play doctor, with what seems to have a working placebo effect on the people on your farm, blissfully unaware, and which symbolizes for you a sacred covenant, a one-sided covenant, I think as Judith Thurman pointed out, between you and them, between Europe and Africa, which in truth is little more than continued exploitation of land and labor. So in this reading, the King's Letter, taken at its very worst, is a paternalistic account of colonized Kenyans who, from Blixen's point of view, ascribe magical healing powers to a royal Danish letter because it comes from a king who has received the gift of the hide of a lion. To that end, we might very well read Barua Soldani through a post-colonial lens as a parable of European dominance and white aristocratic feudal privilege in British East Africa that seduces its readers into accepting that inequality, just as the Kikuyu accept the illusion of the palliative care produced by the placebo effect of a letter from a distant Danish king. And yet, as I'll also suggest, and as our panelists have suggested earlier, there are paradoxes. As Susan Brantley suggests of the segment from An Immigrant's Notebook in Out of Africa, which is one of the pieces is titled, "The Wild Came to the Aid of the Wild," in which a leopard eats off an ox's hind legs to save him from a life of servitude to his master under the yoke. That the King's Letter is also a text that might subvert and in some ways undermine English imperialism, narrated as it is by a foreigner writing in English, the language of the colonizer, and told through the eyes of a Danish woman pioneer who is very much part of a feudal system of land ownership and a beneficiary of the social and economic hierarchy of colonialism, and yet critical of its inequality and its racism, and deeply empathetic towards the people it oppresses. So this is a question I think we can all return to in the Q&A, and one I'd like to reflect further on with my fellow panelists in connection with the exhibition of the artist featured here tonight, Jeannette Ehlers, whose work includes the first public statue of a black woman in Denmark, Mary Thomas, leader of the 1878 St. Croix labor riot, whose work addresses, as I think you see around the room, questions of memory, questions of race, and questions of colonialism, which are all questions that Blixen raises throughout her work, including in the King's Letter. I also want to add that any criticism I might make myself of Blixen's politics comes from my deep admiration for the aesthetics of her writing and my awareness of the complexity of her subject position as a white woman and a Dane in an English colony. And although I agree with much of Susan Brantley's scholarship that challenges simplistic post-colonial critiques of Blixen's work, which make her out to be less complex and less humane than she actually was, I would recommend in particular Brantley's 2013 Karen Blixen's Challenges to Post-Colonial Criticism. I also want to be careful not to romanticize or whitewash Blixen's colonial or colonialist legacy. As Brantley points out in that article Out of Africa, and I would say that this is also true of the King's Letter, it's not just another colonial text and that its political complexities are worth investigating. Brantley concludes, and I quote here from her conclusion, "The differences most likely stem from Blixen's identity as a woman and a Dane living in colonial British East Africa. Are there elements of racism and colonial prejudice in Out of Africa? Absolutely. Given the historical circumstances under which it was written, anything else would be astounding. What is more surprising is the genuine effort Blixen makes to advocate for Africans and their culture to her implied British colonial audience. Out of Africa has much more to offer post-colonial criticism if it is not merely dismissed and relegated to the category of racist colonial romanticism. There is more to it than that," end quote. This takes me now to the foreword to Judith Thurman's masterful biography, which I had the pleasure of rereading, preparing for this panel over the last few weeks. And I'm delighted to have Judith here on Zoom right now. Because one of the figures who appears in that foreword is Kamante himself, who I was pleased to learn that Judith met when she was researching the biography in the 1970s and early 80s. So for Kamante himself, who figures prominently in this beautifully written new foreword, I want to quote from that foreword because I think, in keeping with the spirit of my talk, we can think of Judith's foreword as a kind of letter from the biographer to her readers as she looks back to the writing of it more than 40 years ago. 1982, the year it was published, and a year later won the National Book Award, which was the year myself was born. And so if I may, especially since we have the luxury of Judith calling in from New York, let me quote from that remarkable passage of the preface, since it will take us back to one of the central figures of Out of Africa, Kamante Gatura, after whom readers will recall the first chapter is named Kamante and Lulu. And it's to whom Kamante I wish to give the last word as I move towards my conclusion. So here I'll quote from Judith Thurman's preface. She writes, "Kamante Gatura had appeared on the farm as a boy of about 12 in 1921, pitifully emaciated with suppurating sores on a leg. Mrs. Karen, as he called her, had treated them, and in time she trained him as her chef. An exquisitely clear soup and an impossibly light souffle were among his specialties, and Denison had served them to the Prince of Wales." Thurman continues, "Kamante and his wife, Wamboy, lived on the ranch in a traditional Kikuyu thatched hut. In retirement, he'd become an artist. After several visits and an exchange of gifts, mine practical and his precious, one of his drawings, he agreed to cook dinner for me in a neighbor's kitchen, starting with clear soup and ending with a souffle. That feast was a highlight of my idyll in the highlands, but today its memory has a bitter aftertaste. Out of Africa celebrates the mystical covenant," there's that word again, "that Denison felt she shared with the natives. They came into my life as a kind of answer to some call in my own natures," she writes. And she compares her love for them to her father's for the soldiers he commanded in the Schleswig's War. "I treated her delusion with an indulgence that time has chastised. There is no such thing as enlightened colonialism, just as there were no squatters on her land. There were only disposed dispossessed Kenyans living in serfdom. I'll make just two small observations on Judith's wonderful writing here, which will take me back to Kamante, with whom I'll end my talk, and perhaps this is something we can discuss further in the Q&A. First, a footnote about the mention of the Prince of Wales, for whom Kamante had cooked soup and soufflé. He came on a visit to the farm in 1928, which Blixen describes at length in Farah, the first chapter of Shadows on the Grass, which, like Barua Asodani, was first delivered as a radio talk in 1950. He was then the Prince of Wales, would become Edward VIII, and after abdicating the throne, the Duke of Windsor. His shifting royal titles are an important detail to the retrospection of the narration of the first chapter of Shadows on the Grass, and the vantage point from which the piece was written more than 20 years after the event occurred. I say an important detail because it allows Blixen to make a point about colonialism, inequality, and taxation. As a Dane, as a foreigner, she wishes to intervene with English royalty on behalf of what she calls, and I quote from Shadows on the Grass, the cause of the natives and the matter of their taxation before the prince. And she is happy about this chance of getting the ear of the future king of England, end quote. She then writes, as I sat beside the prince at dinner, I cautiously tried to turn his interest the way I wanted, and he did indeed on the next day come out to the farm to have tea with me. He walked with me into the huts of the squatters and made inquiries as to what they possessed in the way of cattle and goats, what they might earn by working on the farm, and what they paid in taxes, writing down the figures. It was to me later on, when I was back in Denmark, a heartbreaking thing that my Prince of Wales should be King of England for only 6 months, end quote. So, in Shadows on the Grass, I reread Blixen's recollected attempt at diplomacy between English royalty and the people who Judith Thurman rightfully calls dispossessed Kenyans living in serfdom, as a kind of noble gesture and part of one of Blixen's creeds of noblesse oblige, because it emphasizes her complex position of living as a Danish subject in an English colony, although herself with a noble title, Baroness, which, as we'll soon see in her very last letter to Kamante, is a title that she never gives up, even at the end of her life, even though Bror had remarried many years earlier and died in 1946, so technically the title was no longer hers. And yet her empathy for the people on her land, notice her use of the possessive adjective, she even calls the Prince of Wales my prince, leads her to try to intercede on their behalf. So she does use her position of power and her proximity to the future king to argue against the injustice of taxation. And yet, with characteristic irony, thanks to her retrospective, wise narration, she reminds us that how could she have ever known that her efforts would be in vain, since King Edward VIII would abdicate the throne after a reign of only 326 days. So it's a bit longer than the 6 months she claims it to be. What she doesn't say is that he abdicated for love, to marry a twice-divorced American woman. Second footnote, there's that word again, covenant, which I mentioned a few times, and which Judith Thurman rightfully questions as a delusion. And that takes us back to the king's letter and back to Out of Africa, since it is a word that Blixen uses so frequently in her memoirs to describe her relationship with the land and the people on it. And it is the word she uses, as we've seen, to close that chapter in Shadows on the Grass. She writes, in paper and blood, a covenant has been signed between the Europeans and the Africans. No similar document of the same relationship is likely to be drawn up again. Covenant, when used as a verb, is an antiquated legal term, such as to agree by lease, deed, or another legal contract, as in the landlord covenants to repair the property. But Blixen doesn't use this word as a verb, she uses it as a noun, and so I think we can't help but hear its biblical connotation, its etymology from Latin and from Old French. That is the old covenant between God and Israel in the Old Testament, a sacred agreement that symbolizes commitment between God and his people, such as the covenants made with Abraham, Moses, and David. This, I believe, is Blixen's sacralizing usage of the word, which mythologizes colonialism, just as she mythologizes the master-servant relationship at the beginning of the Farah chapter. And equating colonialism as a covenant between the oppressed and the oppressor is, as Judith has insightfully pointed out, a delusion. So as I move towards my conclusion, I'd like to share with you two last letters, which are fittingly letters of farewell, one to Kamante and one from Kamante. The first is by Karen Blixen, likely written by dictation to Clara Svensson, and dated July 19th, 1962, sent from Buxtehude to Nairobi and addressed to Kamante. A copy of this letter is kept in the Houghton Library archives, where we came upon it last year, and I've chosen it for two reasons. First, it's written just a month and a half before Blixen dies, which shows us that even so late in life, more than 30 years out of Kenya, at age 77, she is still remembering her past life there and still hasn't forgotten the people on her former farm. On the contrary, the act of writing to them is an act of remembering, an act of farewell. And second, it's addressed to Kamante, one of the central figures of Out of Africa. And it's a short letter, so I'll project it here on the typescript. I think it's legible, but the type might be a bit faint on the projector, so I don't think the Baroness would disapprove if I read it aloud. And I'll stand up to do so because I can't see the laptop from here. So she writes, and I want you to pay attention to how she addresses Kamante too. My good and faithful servant, Kamante, comma. I was glad to get your letter with the two photos and to learn that you and your family are well. I was also glad to hear about you from Mr. Peter Beard, and I wish I had been with you to my old house so that we could talk of old days. I am sending you a small present of money to help you a little in the bad times. I am still living in the old house where I was born. It is very lovely here, and I am well. Of course, she will soon die in the house where she was born. Mr. Thomas is well, and he asked me to send you his greetings. He has got 4 children and 6 grandchildren. He is living not far from me. I pray to God that you may be well, and that your children and your whole family may be in good health and have good luck. I wish that I could see you again. So goodbye, Kamante. Baroness Blixen. And you see beneath her signature that someone has written in blue ink, I don't know who, which I've transcribed on the side, that the letter was postmarked in Nairobi exactly 2 weeks before her death. I mentioned that the letter is addressed to my good and faithful servant, Kamante, spelled with a D rather than the usual T. I'm not sure why that is. Maybe Catherine can tell us later. And signed Baroness Blixen, who I, if I recall, also took great pleasure in being called Lioness Blixen. So even out of Africa, in Denmark decades later, her aristocratic rank abides, titles remain, social hierarchy well in place, master and servant, up to her dying breath, notwithstanding the genuine affection of the tone of the letter and the generosity of the gift of money. Blixen must have known she was dying, and when she says goodbye to Kamante, wishing I could see you again, it is only that, a wish. To conclude, I'll share the last letter I've chosen, which is from Kamante himself, when he first learns of Blixen's death. A copy is kept at Harvard in the Robert D. Graff collection. The letter is undated, but he writes to Peter Beard, the photographer, in reply to a letter dated September 12th, sent just 5 days after Blixen's death. Here he speaks of death and of the afterlife he imagines awaiting her. Reading his letter now, I can't help but recall the last line of Babette's feast, when Philippa, remembering Achille Papin's letter from the past, says to Babette that this is not the end, and how you will enchant the angels. So in closing, I'll give not the last word to Karen Blixen out of Denmark, but to Kamante Gatura, writing from his Kikuyu village outside of Nairobi. Dear Mr. Peter Beard, I'm so happy to receive your letter dated September 12th, 1962. But however, I was deeply shocked to learn the death of my everlasting dear Baroness Blixen, and I wholeheartedly shared this sad news with you and the rest friends. Had I been in any ancestral power, I could keep her immortal as my dear parent. I was always regarding her like my parents who brought me up. I share the prayer with you and friends to keep her in the real paradise. We shall meet her in the beautiful shore where all human sits in peaceful rest. I am beyond the happiness for this message you suddenly sent to me. The kind deeds I was receiving for her are untold. Thank you very much. I'll turn it over to Catherine.
Thank you so much, Thomas. Thank you for this very deep insight into this topic tonight. So I'm going to speak about something totally different because I'm very inspired by contemporary art in general and by this exhibition as well. And I must say that actually tonight is one of the artists present here with whom I've been working a lot. Maria Dubin, who is a fantastic painter, has been doing projects at the Karen Blixen Museum together with me. Tonight, however, I will focus on some of the artists who have been treating with these post-colonial issues. And I think I have a PowerPoint. Yes. So I will start commenting on, there it is. So one of my favorite topics is how to show and display literature. Because how on earth do you do when you want to do an exhibition about a Blixen content? How on earth do you show something about literature? And in my personal life, I have many heroes and many heroines. But one of them is Yves Klein, a French artist whom you all know, of course. And with this first image, that's the leap into the void, le saut dans le vide, from 1960, just 2 years before he died. Actually, he died the same year as Karen Blixen. And it's a photomontage. Well, he wants to sort of get lost in space. He loses himself, and it's been debated for a long time, how does he do this leap? Actually, his wife and friends were there waiting for him to touch the ground with a mattress and stuff. So it's one of the first ways of showing a photography which is not quite true. And this is also about truth. What is the truth, and what do you see, and how do you interpret it? And the second image, of course, will be Yves Klein's imprint on the world, the artist's imprint, which is so important to us to understand and get clarifications that you get through art. So the blue imprint on the world is very important to me as well. And finally, I want to say, and thank you to Thomas, with whom I often discussed matters of translation. And in my opinion, I am very inspired by you. It's all about translation. It's all about translating meaning from one space to another through art, through music, through knowledge, through research. Translation is so important. And thank you, Thomas, for sharing that vision. And I've really, really taken that into my conception of the world. Karen Blixen, of course, as you know, we don't have to repeat that. She's one of the very, very famous Danish writers. She's internationally known. She's somebody who's beyond the Danish scene. She had a hard time getting success in Denmark. She was successful in the Anglo-Saxon world before being successful in Denmark. So she's like a very strange bird in Denmark, as well as in the rest of the world, I would say. Behind Blixen's stories, well, you will say that this book called Out of Africa is sort of very closely linked to her own life. Because what happened was that she had this inspiration, and she was very inspired by the Kikuyu's way of telling stories and the Maasais in Kenya. She took that tradition in and, made it into her own way of discussing and transmitting literature. So she was telling stories all of the time, and Out of Africa, of course, is a sort of very romanticized vision of her many years in Kenya. She didn't write in Danish, she wrote in English first, and sometimes she translated, and sometimes she rewrote in Danish. And I will show you an example of that. You can see that this is one of the pages from the manuscript of Out of Africa from the Royal Danish Library. And, well, we're not going into details with that, but you can see that you have the English original version, and on top of that, she writes with her own words in Danish, and very often the two versions are very different one from the other. I'm sure you all know that, but it's still nice and funny to sort of recall this great difference between the Danish and English versions. Well, you were talking about lions and lionesses, etc., and this picture is one of the very classic pictures of Karen Blixen in Kenya. She sits, and probably she didn't shoot the lions herself. I mean, we were most convinced that she didn't, but she wanted to make it look like as if she had. And the smile she has on her face is a little bit like the Mona Lisa smile. You don't really know if she's happy or sad. Anyway, she's proud, but maybe also a bit insecure in this company. She took a lot of space to describe the noble animals of Africa, and also the joys of shooting that you can find quite difficult to understand nowadays, but I know still many people go hunting. But well, anyway, that's one of the images I just wanted to show you, as well as this one, which is a very happy moment between her and her husband, Bor von Blixen-Finnicke, who was Swedish. That was before their divorce, and they are on a safari, visibly, and they're having a nice time, and even a tablecloth on the table, which is quite original, I would think, to remember that kind of details in a safari. Well, when I first started out in the museum, I was very preoccupied with how to communicate the legacy of Karen Blixen. And the first exhibition I had the chance to do was this exhibition installed in a van. It's a video art piece by Candice Brights, who's a South African artist. She's about 50 years old now. She represented South Africa at the Venice Biennial some years ago. And she made this piece about Meryl Streep's women's roles. Maybe some of you are nodding, you remember this piece? And there you can see the installation that was in collaboration with the Riksutställningar in Stockholm. So they had really they had done a good job to install the piece in a van. So you went in and you saw all these images of women. And of course, there was also images of Meryl Streep as Karen Blixen. And how come that was interesting? Well, this is, you can recognize Sophie's Choice, this was Devil Wears Prada, all these very famous roles interpreted by Meryl Streep. And it was, of course, to focus on the strong woman's role, but also the woman who's sometimes a bit lost, who's sometimes lost in space and lost in her own life and in her own world, as we all are, of course. So that was the first sort of contemporary art piece that I wanted to show you. And then we had this exhibition called Not About Karen Blixen, which to me is a kind of an example of how you can actually work with post-colonialism and contemporary art. The exhibition was not about Karen Blixen because it didn't want to, sing the tale of her, but sing a tale about something different, something in connection with her, in connection with her time. It was part of a festival called My World Images, and there were parallel exhibitions in the city center of Copenhagen, as well as at the Karen Blixen Museum. And the thing about doing it not about her would also give an arm length to what the content could be. So one of the pieces was called Rebuilding, Remembering and Renewing. And all the artists worked in pairs, one Kenyan artist together with one Danish artist to develop new works about Karen Blixen, about the time she was living in and about today's life. This piece was an installation by Arthur Malinda and Gillian Gansan. It's called Rebuilding, Remembering and Renewing. It's a paraphrase of a writer's study installed just outside Karen Blixen's own study. So you had this installation as a piece of artwork in relation with the actual space inside. And you can actually also see the differences between what could be imagined to be a writer's study today and before. The second piece was called Too Long Are Our Memories by James Murioki and Michelle Eistrup from Denmark. And they did performance, photo, music, video installation. Just a few shots from the installations of the pieces. Very beautiful performance. This was actually, you can't see it, but it was a screening of a body performance on the train between Nairobi and Mombasa, which was a very important train railroad. When Karen Blixen arrived at Mombasa, she took this train to get into Nairobi, and it's been also very sort of famous for its, the way it was built, etc. So that was a performance on that, and then there was lots of screenings of Kenya and Denmark of today. Just a few more installation shots. And this is kind of a nice piece as well. It's called We Had a Writer in Africa by Søren Assenholt. He was educated as a carpenter and redid the floor in Caroline's room. And Caroline, she was Karen Blixen's housekeeper. She lived there most of her life with her son. And by redoing the floor in her study or in her room, there was a focus on all the people's steps, generation through generation, how to also always remember what's been going on before and the connection to ancestors. And finally, I just want to show you a few images from an exhibition called In Your Words by Nana Dubois-Boule and Brendan Fernandez. They met in New York and they collaborated and they continued at Rungstedlund and did some very nice pieces. This is one of the very strange birds flying around the museum, an imaginary African bird, I think, going away. And it was like 6 pieces of collaborative projects. And the way they worked was in connection with language, identity, translation, of course, and all the topics that unite a person when you deal with it in this way. There we have another strange bird flying past Karen Blixen's own bookshelf. And then the exhibition was actually, it was reviewed in Art in America, had very good reviews. And one of the very nice pieces of this exhibition was this, the parrot. And the parrot is Farah's parrot, and it's actually another letter written to Karen Blixen by Farah, who was also an assistant of hers. There's the stairs, In Your Words was the exhibition, and the piece is called Farah's Letter. And this flickering neon parrot tells a story. And I don't know if any of you know this letter that I'm referring to. Anyway, it's a letter by Farah, and he's bought a present for Karen Blixen. She's away on a trip, coming back to Kenya. And he writes this letter to her saying, I have a present for you when you get back home. I have this bird for you. It's a parrot. And I'm really sorry, but it only speaks French because it was born in the French Congo. But I'm sure that when you get it, it will very quickly learn to speak Swahili and English, maybe even Danish. And of course, this is about the appropriation of language, and when you merge and when people move, how do they sort of adapt themselves, and how do they sometimes lose their own language and sometimes get new ones. So this was a I thought, very fine piece about this parrot, and it was accompanied by the sound of the reading of the letter in Swahili. So there was also a sound to this flickering parrot. There's a few words about Farah's parrot, and you can actually find it on different websites. It was very well reviewed in Art in America. So very nice piece. And this is also the part of the piece, In Your Words, focusing on words, on translations, on being bilingual, being away from your own space into new spaces. How do you deal? How do you do? And what do you become? This was part of the video, focusing on the language of Blixen's writing and also focusing on the birds' names in Danish, Swahili, and English. Just a few installation shots. And the last piece I think I want to show you is called Camanage. It's curtain and sound, and that's a piece where the artists read out loud the names of the little birds in the bird sanctuary, and also read it in Swahili, because Brendan Fernandez was brought up in Kenya as an Indian, in Swahili, and Nana Dubabul in Danish with her very nice accent from Jutland, reading out loud the names of the different birds. So the bird theme is also very important in Blixen's life. I don't want to go on much longer because we're running short of time. So I will just thank you for your patience, and especially thank my fellow panelists whom I greet. And let's see if we have a few questions from the floor. Thank you so much. Any questions in French? You can also we can take them in French as well. Do you have a question, Thomas? To start out to Judith, maybe? Or?
I have a question.
Yeah. Please.
Yeah, I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
You know, I'm listening to Thomas's wonderful discussion of the Barua Soldani. It is entirely possible, and in keeping also with Karen Blixen's notion of the superior manners and refinement of the Africans compared to the boorish Europeans, that the wounded boy was pretending to feel better as a gift, as a very well-bred gift to this hysterical white woman trying to make the pain go away with a stupid piece of paper. And that it's something, I think it's an interpretation, true or not, that she would have smiled at ironically, because it's close to her own sense of irony, that of course the paper from this couldn't take the pain away, the excruciating suffering of a broken leg or a wounded leg. And I can see that. My own experience of the Africans, they're really exquisite manners, a kind of discretion that is alien to Europeans. So it did occur to me listening to the story. It also occurred to me that this never took place at all. That this was because there's a lot of fabulism in Out of Africa. It's a world, a life seen from a very, very, very high distance detachment, which was hard to achieve, but she does. And so I also, why is she taking the king's letter in her riding clothes or that? This would have been something to be carefully put away under the blotter. But there was that aspect. And Kamande. Njoki corrected the pronunciation. You should correct all our pronunciations of Kikuyu words, by the way. It's a hard D. Kamande, yes?
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. He was a wonderful artist. And there should be, I wonder if at some point there couldn't be a show of his work at the Karen Blixen Museum. That would be really something special.
Yeah, I totally agree. Thank you, Judith. And I pass on.
No, thank you, Judith. I like that reading of the king's letter. If the boy's pretending that the letter has a magical healing powers for her benefit, not for his. The only thing that I would ask you about is, then why does she claim that the letter continues to circulate among her people and continues to provide this kind of magical healing power, not only to the boy, but to dozens of others? Do you read that as exaggeration and fantasy? And if so,
Yes.
It is interesting that when she introduces this tale, and I didn't play this part of the recording, but if I had played another minute or so of the recording, she would have insisted that when she wrote Out of Africa, she says that she was careful to make sure that every detail she put into the book was true, and that when she was unsure of someone's name or the name of a place, she would write to her friends in Kenya to make sure that she got it right. I think she says that she wanted to be on safe ground. But I like your reading that the more she insists that it's a true tale, the more it is a fantasy. So that's another paradox.
She thought it was true, perhaps. I don't even know that she thought it was true, but she's remembering something, and it's colored by reminiscence and wishfulness and desire, and of course Dennis. I know from studying the letters. Anybody knows studying the chronology. He would. There were a year when they wouldn't see each other, and there were all kinds of things that are not recounted. There are all kinds of things that are fudged. There's things that are there's endless instances of omission to create this perfect vision of a lost world. I don't think she would have rode around the farm with that letter, just putting it on people's, psoriasis or indigestion or malaria or whatever it was. That seems pretty far-fetched.
And evidence to support that reading is what Catherine told me about the letter, which is that it's not at all mud-stained or blood-stained as she claims it was, because there's a copy of it in the Royal Library. Could you tell us about that, Catherine?
Well, it's just the fact that I once actually saw this letter, and I had expected something totally different, but it was very clean and very well preserved, and so of course it's just everything is just made up. So yeah.
Except the letter did exist.
The letter did exist. Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
I would like to know the other side of that story. So if we ask the boy, or if we ask the people that were there, what would they say, right? So we know, for example, in Kikuyu culture, there was a great belief in magic. So if you wanted a great hunt, you went to a morogi, we call them, or a modomogo, and they cast a spell for you, and they would take inorganic or organic material and put it in a little horn, and you carried that horn, and you had to recite some sort of spell to create an outcome that you wanted, whether you wanted to fall in love, to fall out of love, to cast an evil spell on a competitor or an enemy or something, a good harvest, what have you. So to me, when Judith and I spoke about this week, it didn't seem all that far-fetched that this boy might actually claim to feel better by having some sort of proximity to this letter. Obviously, this sort of anthropological work is not my area of expertise, but I would be curious. I mean, this has been written about most famously by Njoki Ng'ang'a in Facing Mount Kenya, where he talks about all of the cultural, social practices of the Kikuyu people. Obviously, these are practices that have been lost today. So even me, going back and studying them, but this was very real, where people believed in this sort of magical power of an organic or inorganic object.
That's so interesting. And something else that she writes about in many places is the power of witches. It's in Deluge at Nordene when August Malinatode, she said it's unbearable to grow old without being a witch. One has to be a witch. Witchcraft is the consolation for age. And she was thinking of the women elders in Africa, the grandmothers and the people. They were sort of liaisons with the spirit world. Yes, thank you for pointing that out. That's true. I have to say that when I met Wamboy, Kamante's wife, she was suffering from really bad arthritis, and I asked her if there was something I could do to help her. She said yes, aspirin. So no more.
So there's no competition when it comes to modern medicine. I'll be the first one to tell you that. And today there's a role for these sort of non-Western adjuvant therapies, aromatherapy or touch and Reiki and all this. There is a role for that. in wellness, even in people who have serious illness, cancer and what have you. So yes, I don't think that Wambui would have asked you for Barua Asoldani for her treatment for her arthritis.
Does the audience have any
Just
questions?
have one question from the audience, and then I think we'll have to wrap it up.
Thank you. I used to live in Denmark 30 years ago, so I think it was fun to hear this. I think Karen Blixen was a very good performer, very good at self-promotion, and as some writers do, they pick things in their life that can make their life look more interesting than it is. I have heard about her depression also. But just for fun, I visited Rungsted, her house. Can you explain why the curtains are going out on the floor, if you know?
I couldn't hear that.
I definitely can. It's a question about the curtains in Rungstedlund. And it's a fact. Maybe you can answer, Tom. No, I think okay. I've answered that question many times, and I'm very pleased to do it. I mean, some of you might see from your inner eye that the curtains are lying on the floor, and even you, Jens, you did lots of photographs of those curtains. They were made of lace. They're very beautiful, and they're very well preserved. I had them actually preserved. But it's a mixture of traditions, because back in the old days, you had to have longer curtains than the walls because there was so much draft coming in the wintertime. So it was very practical to have longer curtains lying on the floor to cut off the draft. That's one thing. Then, of course, Karen Blixen bought these curtains on they had the lengths they had, and she thought it was too bad to cut them off. And she had also, as a child, seen in the Danish castles that there was this kind of tradition about, showing off how wealthy you were. You wouldn't have to just cut off. You could actually, allow yourself to have more material than necessary. So she thought it was pretty, looked good, and it still does. Yeah. Mm. Any conclusions? I think we'll go to the Verre de l'Amitié. I will really, really want to thank all of you, dear friends from New York City, with us tonight. And dear Thomas, coming from Boston, thank you so much for being here. Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Thank you, everybody. Let's have a nice drink of wine and continue the discussion. Thank you so much.